In the spring of 1952, in the basement of the London Metropolitan Archives, a surveyor comparing ordnance maps noticed something that should not have existed. Two sets of blueprints lay before her, one dated 1838, the other 1891, both depicting the same terraced houses on Gower Street. The street level had not moved. The front doors occupied identical positions, yet the windows she knew as basement windows sat, in the earlier drawing, at ground level, their sills flush with the pavement. No notation explained the change. No amendment appeared in the margin. Between the two dates, the earth had risen or the city had sunk, time 500ms, and no one had thought to record why. Rain fell that afternoon on the streets of Bloomsbury. The surveyor walked to Gower Street with both blueprints folded in her leather case. She counted the steps descending to each basement entrance. 7, sometimes 8. The windows at street level, iron barred and half obscured by the pavement edge, gazed upward from wells cut into the stone. Pedestrians passed without looking down. The windows had always been there, in living memory. Yet the blueprint insisted otherwise. In 1838, those same windows had opened at eye level, admitting horizontal light into rooms that were not basements, but ground. Floors. She checked the foundation lines on both drawings. They matched. The building footings had not been dug deeper. The walls had not been raised. What had changed was the street itself. By the evening of 12th June 1859, in a surveyor's office near King's Cross, a clerk recorded the completion of a sewer line beneath Gray's Inn Road. The ledger entry noted that road surface had been raised by an average of 4 feet along a half-mile stretch to accommodate gradient requirements for drainage. A marginal note, added in different ink, mentioned that adjoining property owners had petitioned against the change. The petition was denied. The road rose. The ground floors became basements. No compensation was recorded. The pattern repeated across London. In Westminster, in Southwark, in Marylebone, the streets climbed while the buildings remained fixed. Photographs from the 1860s show the moment of transition. In one image, dated August 1863, workmen stand atop freshly laid cobblestones on Tottenham Court Road. Behind them, the windows of a Georgian terrace sit half buried, their upper panes still visible above the new street level, their lower panes already below ground. The exposure is long enough that the workmen blur slightly, ghosts caught between two elevations. The official explanation appears in municipal records with bureaucratic brevity. London's sanitation crisis demanded modern sewerage. Gravity required downward slope. Existing streets, built over centuries without coordinated planning, followed medieval paths that rose and fell according to ancient topography. To achieve consistent gradient for the new sewer lines running beneath, engineers had two choices: excavate the sewers deeper at enormous cost, or raise the streets above to create the necessary fall. They chose the latter. What the records do not mention is how quickly it happened. Between 1858 and 1875, the main thoroughfares of central London rose by an average of 3 to 7 feet. Property deeds from the period show no adjustment in building heights. Houses built in 1820 with ground floor parlors found themselves, by 1870, with basement parlors. The change occurred not gradually, but in concentrated bursts, street by street, as each new sewer line was installed. On 3rd November 1868, a resident of Marchmont Street wrote to the Board of Works. The letter, preserved in the archive with its wax seal intact, complained that the recent elevation of the roadway had rendered her ground floor windows subterranean and deprived of wholesome light. She requested that the board lower the pavement in front of her property to restore the original relationship between street and window. The response, dated 2 weeks later, informed her that the new street level was permanent and that she might consider installing a light well if additional illumination was required. Light wells. The solution appeared across the city like surgical scars. Iron railings topped brick-lined pits that descended from the new pavement level to the original ground floor, now several feet below. These areas, as they were called, created a buffer zone between the risen street and the buried windows. They allowed air and light to reach what had become, overnight, basement spaces. In wealthier districts, the wells were faced with stone, time 350 scheme, and fitted with decorative ironwork. In poorer areas, they were simple brick trenches, often damp, collecting rain and refuse. The transformation was not uniform. Side streets, too narrow or insignificant to justify the expense of raising, remained at their original levels. This created a topography of steps and slopes, as thoroughfares climbed while alleys and mews stayed low. Walking from a main street into a side passage often meant descending a short flight of stone steps, as if entering a lower stratum of the city. The effect was that of geological layering. The new city built literally on top of the old, separated by a few feet of compacted earth, rubble, and ash used as fill. In a photograph dated March 1872, taken on Southampton Row, the discontinuity is visible. The main road sits high, its surface level with what were once first-floor windows. A narrow lane branches off to the left, and where they meet, a cascade of 5 brick steps descends from the elevated thoroughfare to the older, lower side street. A woman in a dark coat stands at the bottom step, looking up. The perspective makes the main road appear to tower above the lane, though the actual difference is perhaps 6 feet. The buildings on either side, built before the change, show windows at mismatched heights. Those facing the main road now half buried, those facing the side lanes still at their original elevation. By 1880, the raised streets had become normalized. Children born after the change knew nothing else. The windows at street level were always basement windows. The ground floors were always 1 story above the pavement. The light wells were always there. Memory adjusted. Language followed. What had been ground floor became lower ground floor. What had been basement became sub-basement, if it was acknowledged at all. Estate agents began advertising properties as having raised ground floors, a phrase that would have been nonsensical 20 years earlier. Yet, physical evidence remained. Inside the houses, the original floor levels persisted. Ceiling heights told the story. A typical Georgian terraced house built between 1800 and 1840 had ground floor ceilings of 11 to 12 feet to accommodate tall windows and create an impression of grandeur. First floor ceilings were slightly lower, perhaps 10 feet. Basement ceilings, if the house had a genuine below-ground basement for servants or storage, rarely exceeded 7 feet. After the streets rose, the proportions became inverted. What was now called the ground floor, the raised entrance level, had ceilings of 10 feet. The floor below, accessed by interior stairs and lit by windows now at street level, the time for Vipimizvarn had ceilings of 12 feet. It was more spacious, more elegant, yet it was classified as basement. The original basement, now 1 level deeper still, remained low-ceilinged and dark. The architecture contradicted the nomenclature. The rooms refused to accept their demotion. On 17 April 1889, a structural surveyor named Thomas Ridley published a pamphlet titled Observations on the Anomalous Elevations of Metropolitan Thoroughfares. Printed in an edition of 200 copies, most now lost, it documented what he called the inversion phenomenon. Ridley had measured ceiling heights in over 300 terraced houses across 5 London boroughs. His data showed that in 73% of properties built before 1850, and situated on roads that had been raised, the lowest habitable floor possessed greater volume and superior original finish than the floor above. He concluded that a significant portion of what is now termed basement accommodation was designed and constructed as principal living space, and retains the architectural characteristics thereof. The pamphlet was not widely reviewed. The one published response, in a trade journal for builders, dismissed Ridley's findings as of antiquarian interest, but no practical consequence. By 1889, the city had moved on. The sewers functioned. Disease rates had fallen. The raised streets were an accepted feature of modern London. To dwell on their origins seemed pedantic, even obstructive. Yet Ridley's observations hinted at something else. If the finest rooms in a house now sat below street level, their windows looking up at passing feet, then the social geography of the home had been disrupted. In the Georgian ideal, the ground floor was the public face, the drawing room, the parlor, the spaces where guests were received and status displayed. These rooms commanded the best light, the highest ceilings, the most elaborate plasterwork. Servants occupied the basement, working in kitchens and sculleries that were always somewhat dark, somewhat damp, somewhat separate from the life above. After the streets rose, the hierarchy collapsed. The principal rooms, now technically below ground, lost their prestige by association. The term basement flat acquired a connotation of cheapness, of diminished expectations. Estate agents began to subdivide properties, converting the large lower ground floor rooms into separate units. What had been a single elegant parlor became a 1-bedroom flat, lit by windows that required bars not for security but to prevent pedestrians from stepping through. The bars themselves are worth noting. In photographs from before the street raising, ground floor windows in residential areas were rarely barred. There was no need. The windows opened at standing height, easily visible from the street, not inviting to thieves. After the change, the windows sat low, partially obscured, accessible from the pavement edge. They became vulnerable. Regulations passed in the 1870s and 80s required iron grills on all windows below the new street level. The justification was practical, but the effect was carceral. Rooms that had once opened freely to the street now gazed out through bars, even in respectable neighborhoods. On 8th September 1902, a writer for the Architectural Review visited a house on Doughty Street, built in 1825. The owner, an elderly gentleman who had lived there since childhood, walked the journalist through the rooms, pointing out the changes. "This was my father's study," he said, gesturing to a room on what was now the lower ground floor. "The window was level with the garden path. He could watch us playing. Now it looks onto a well, and the council has made us put bars across." The journalist noted that the room retained its original character: paneled walls, a marble fireplace, elaborate cornicing at the ceiling line. It was, by any measure, a gentleman's study, but the address listed it as Flat B, basement level. The old man led the journalist downstairs to what was now the genuine basement, one floor below the street. Here the ceilings dropped, the walls were plain brick, and the windows, small high rectangles, admitted almost no light. "This was the kitchen," he said, "the servants' domain. We children were not allowed down here." He paused, looking around. "Now, of course, it is storage. No one could live in such a space. Too dark, too damp. Yet the floor above, which was once our finest room, is called a basement as well. The word has lost precision." The journalist's article, published in November of that year, suggested that the raised streets had created a linguistic confusion. Basement had come to mean any floor below the principal entrance, regardless of its original purpose or architectural quality. This conflation obscured the fact that many such basements were designed as primary living spaces and retained characteristics, ceiling height, window size, decorative detail, that marked them as superior to the floors above. The article concluded by asking whether the city's vocabulary had kept pace with its infrastructure. It had not. By the early 20th century, the process of street raising had largely ceased. The major sewer lines were complete. The engineering crisis had passed. London's topography stabilized, but the effects persisted. Thousands of houses, built over a century earlier to relate to streets at one elevation, now related to streets at another. The ground floors became subterranean by municipal decree. The windows, designed to capture horizontal morning light, now captured only the shadows of pedestrians and the undersides of carriages, later automobiles. In some districts, the contrast between old and new became stark. Victorian terraces, built after the street raising, were designed with the new elevations in mind. Their ground floors sat well above the pavement, accessed by stoops of 6 or 8 steps. True basements lay below, with small windows set into retaining walls, clearly utilitarian. These buildings accepted the new topography, but adjacent Georgian terraces, predating the change, retained the old relationship. Their entrances opened at pavement level or just above, and their so-called basement windows were large, symmetrical, decorated, evidence of a different intention. A map from 1911, held in the archives of the London Topographical Society, color codes streets according to the decade they were raised. The result is a patchwork. Some areas show concentrated bursts, entire neighborhoods lifted in the 1860s. Others show scattered, piecemeal changes extending into the 1880s. A few streets remain marked as original grade retained. These are typically narrow lanes, courtyards, or secondary passages that were either too insignificant to alter or physically impossible to change without demolishing buildings. Walking these streets today creates a sensation of descending into the past, stepping down into an older London that sits just below the surface. The sensation is not metaphorical. Archaeologists excavating Victorian sites often encounter evidence of the street raising, a distinct layer of rubble, brick fragments, and compressed ash that marks the boundary between the old ground level and the new. This layer, typically 3 to 7 feet thick, is informally called the lift. Below it, original pavements remain, sometimes still intact. In a dig conducted near Russell Square in '98, workers uncovered a section of 1830s flagstone pavement buried beneath the modern road. The stones showed wear patterns, smooth grooves where foot traffic had concentrated, worn edges at the curbs. People had walked there, daily, for decades. Then the city rose, and those stones became archaeology. Documents from the period rarely mention the experience of living through the change. One exception is a diary entry, dated 22nd July 1864, written by a clerk living on Tavistock Place. He describes waking to the sound of carts dumping rubble in the street. By midday, the level of the road in front of his house had risen by 2 feet. By the end of the week, it was 4 feet higher, and his front door, which had opened directly onto the pavement, now opened onto a trench. He writes, "We must now descend several steps to reach the street, and ascend several steps to enter our home. The window of our sitting room, which once commanded a view of passing traffic, now looks only at the base of the wall across the way. It is as if we have been buried while still alive." The entry is matter of fact, almost resigned. No outrage, no formal protest. Just an observation that the relationship between home and city has fundamentally changed. The sitting room, losing its view, loses something intangible. It becomes interior in a way it was not before, even though its walls and windows have not moved. What moved was the world outside. This sense of inversion, of the world shifting while the structure remains static, pervades the few personal accounts that survive. A letter from 1871, written by a widow in Holborn, describes her confusion at receiving mail, time 309 fjams, addressed to lower ground floor flat, when she knew, with certainty, that she lived on the ground floor. Her windows opened onto the street. She could see out. Yet the Postal Service, following new municipal guidelines, classified her residence as below ground. The classification was technically correct. The street was now above her, but experientially false. She still lived at ground level. It was the street that had moved. Modern urban planners, reviewing the Victorian street-raising campaign, have noted its audacity. Altering the elevation of major thoroughfares by several feet across multiple boroughs while the city continued to function required coordination and confidence. It also required a disregard for existing structures. The buildings could not be lifted. Their foundations, set in the 18th and early 19th centuries, were fixed. So, the streets rose around them, and the buildings sank, relatively speaking, into the new topography. The consequences were not only architectural, but social. The stigma that attached to basement living had not existed in the same way before the streets rose. A ground floor flat in Georgian London was respectable, even desirable. After the change, a flat whose windows opened at the new street level, even if it was the same flat, in the same building, with the same ceiling height and same decorative detail, became a basement flat, with all the attendant connotations of darkness, dampness, and diminished status. Estate records from the late 19th century show rent adjustments tracking the change. A property on Gray's Inn Road, divided into flats in 1882, listed the lower ground floor unit at 70% of the rent charged for the floor above, despite the lower unit having higher ceilings and larger rooms. The market had internalized the new hierarchy. Below ground meant less valuable, even when below ground was an artifact of infrastructure, not design. On 14th March 1923, a housing reformer named Eleanor Ashford gave a lecture at the Royal Society of Arts titled "The Lost Ground Floors of London." She argued that thousands of high-quality residential rooms had been effectively devalued by the street-raising campaign, and were now underutilized or subdivided into inferior accommodation. Ashford proposed that the city formally recognize the distinction between original basement and converted lower ground floor, and that planning regulations encourage the restoration of these spaces to their intended use as primary living areas. The proposal was received politely, but never acted upon. The language had already shifted. The basement was the basement, time forfeited, regardless of its origins. Ashford's lecture included lantern slides showing Victorian basements from the interior. One image, taken in a house on Gower Street, the same street the surveyor had walked in 1952, shows a room with a 12-foot ceiling, ornate plaster molding, and a large sash window fitted with iron bars. Light enters at a steep angle, illuminating one corner while leaving the rest in shadow. The floor is parquet, the fireplace is marble, and a chandelier hangs from a ceiling rose. It is unambiguously a formal room, yet the caption reads, "Basement reception room, typical of post-elevation adaptation." The phrase post-elevation adaptation is revealing. It suggests that the room adapted, when in fact the room had not changed at all. What adapted was the city's frame of reference. Today in 24, the phenomenon persists. Walk along any Victorian terrace in central London, Bloomsbury, Marylebone, Kensington, and the basement windows are there, their sills level with or slightly below the pavement, their panes reinforced with iron grills. Real estate listings describe these as garden-level flats or lower ground floor apartments, euphemisms that attempt to soften the connotation of basement without acknowledging the history. The ceiling heights give them away. Time 50 years. No one builds a basement with 12-foot ceilings, but they do build ground floors that way. A student arriving in London for the first time, renting a flat in one of these buildings, might wonder why the most spacious room in the house sits below the entrance. The proportions seem inverted. The grandest space is the lowest. The explanation requires looking not at the building, but at the street. The street moved, the building stayed, and the language followed the street, not the structure. In archives across the city, the blueprints remain, paired documents showing the same buildings at different elevations. They are rarely consulted. 10500s. The transformation they record is complete. The streets are high, the ground floors are low, and the basement windows look up at a city that rose quietly and deliberately over the course of 2 decades in the 19th century, leaving no record of what it felt like to live through the change, only the physical evidence of rooms that insist, through their proportions and their details, that they were never meant to be underground.